My name is Cindy Heitzman, Executive Director of the California Preservation Foundation. Thank you for joining this webinar titled The Path to Compliance, Treatment of Exiting Systems in Historic Buildings. The format for today's webinar will include an hour presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and I will either reply to you or hold the question until the end for the panelists to answer. Please refer to the audio tab in the toolbar and select if you are listening through the telephone or speakers. To hide or unhide this tool, click on the yellow arrow. Please adjust your volume on your computer or your phone. Today's presentation will be by Alan Dreyfus, Associate Principal with Wisjani Elsner Associates, and Chris Wozny, Cody Anderson Wozny Architects, Inc. Alan Dreyfus is an Associate Principal with Wisjani Elsner Associates in Emeryville. He has more than 20 years' experience in historic preservation and has extensive experience in the rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of historic structures. He currently serves as the chair of the California Historical Building Safety Board, the board responsible for the development and administration of the California Historical Building Code, and was instrumental in the development of the 2001 and 2007 editions of the California Historical Building Code. Chris Wozny is a founding principal of Cody Anderson Wozny Architects, Inc. in Palo Alto. Chris brings a wealth of experience to designing and managing challenging projects for universities, community-based institutions, and nonprofits. He particularly relishes the challenges of finding appropriate and distinctive design responses within established campuses. His work includes large-scale renovations and adaptive reuse projects on historic buildings, as well as new buildings. Chris is on the faculty of the Architectural Design program at Stanford University. He holds a Master's of Architecture degree from UC Berkeley and a Bachelor of Arts in English from Stanford University. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, well, good morning. I'm on. Just so you know, I'm going to be covering the prescriptive provisions of the code. Chris is going to follow with some case studies. I'm going to try to not make this too dry, but we do have some things to go through that I think are important. The first thing that's important to state is that the California Historical Building Code is the applicable code for qualified historical buildings in the state of California. Somehow, there we go. A qualified historical building is any building or structure deemed of historical, architectural, or cultural importance by a local, state, or federal jurisdiction, and the important words here are deemed of importance, and that can come in a number of forms. The CHBC is actually enacted by statute. It's not adopted by local jurisdictions like regular codes. Consequently, it is mandatory for use by the building official. It does supersede all other codes and ordinances in the state, though you may find some pushback from building officials if you state that. I'm going to be speaking mostly to the prescriptive provisions of the code as they affect egress, but we always have to keep in mind that the prescriptive provisions in the code are fairly minimal. The main function of the Historical Building Code is to provide a basis for development of alternative methods to meet the intent of the CHBC. This intent is taken right out of the administrative chapter, Chapter 1, but it's repeated in almost every chapter of the code. The underlying intent of the CHBC is to facilitate a continued use of historic buildings in a manner that preserves their historical integrity while providing a reasonable level of safety and access. And reasonable is where the negotiations come in. This provision, like I said, is repeated in each section, and it is really the basis for making and creating alternative solutions to regular code provisions. It's important to know that, in existing structures, in general, with non-conforming egress, don't necessarily have to be upgraded. And there are provisions in both the regular code and in the CHBC that cover that and allow these to remain in use. This is from the applicability section of the California Building Code. Existing structures are allowed to remain in occupancy without upgrades to current code. Note that the qualifier is that the building official doesn't deem that these upgrades are necessary for general safety and welfare of the occupants and public. This puts a lot of discretion in the hands of the building official. If you go to the CHBC, again, Chapter 1, you'll see that it goes further and specifically states that a qualified historical building can remain in use if it met the requirements of the code at the time of construction. It limits the discretion of the official here because it states that you have to find that a distinct hazard is present before it requires upgrades, and the CHBC defines distinct hazard. You'll note that towards the end of this little paragraph here, it says that conditions that do not meet the requirements of regular code and ordinances do not of themselves constitute a distinct hazard. I pulled up a couple of images here. This is a truss in the Riggers Loft, which is a historic building in Shipyard number 3 in the city of Richmond. This looks like a distinct hazard and probably is. What this kicked off was a study of all the other trusses in the building. And although the trusses were found to be overstressed for current codes, it was determined that this fracture was actually caused by overloading from ponding of the water, and the building officials did not require upgrading of the rest of the trusses to meet current code. This is a stair in a hotel, I think it's an 8-story hotel in San Francisco. There are all kinds of things that might be considered hazardous here, especially considering the woman who was inebriated and fell down these stairs, which is why I ended up taking this photograph. But it does not actually constitute a distinct hazard by definition of the CHBC. In general, the CHBC Chapter H-3 states that if the occupancy of a historic building is changed, it must be determined that it must be then brought up to meet the requirements of the CHBC and not the regular code. There is no requirement that a building that's a qualified historical building be brought up to meet regular code. I'm going to get into the specific elements of Chapter 8-5. In Chapter 8-5, as I said before, the purpose and intent are restated, and further, in the next section, the requirement that a building official grant exceptions to regular code is restated as the basis for creating alternatives where specific provisions are not provided. In terms of specific provisions, I'm going to go through those pretty quickly and show a few examples where those seem reasonable. Existing door openings and corridor widths are allowed to remain in use, provided they are adequate for egress. Adequate is not defined. If the existing dimensions are close to meeting the current code, they probably should be allowed. So we're looking for other places where we might get indications of what an adequate door opening might be or what a corridor adequate corridor might be. For example, where corridors and doors are serving accessible spaces, you would actually go to Chapter 8-6 to look at the provisions there. And in 8-6, there's an allowance for a door to be 29.5 inches minimum clear opening. That might be a reasonable place to start when you're looking for what is an adequate opening. In addition, in the regular code, a corridor, an accessible corridor is required to be 36 inches in width and in fact can sometimes be reduced even to 32 inches. This might be a reasonable place to look to an alternative for the typical 44-inch requirements. This is just another photo of the Riggers Loft out in Point Richmond. This door is actually a 32-inch door with only about a 30.5-inch clear opening, and it was allowed to remain as an exit door. This is a corridor at the Washburn Cottage in Wilona in Yosemite National Park. It's about a 40-inch corridor, and again, there was no requirement that this be changed in order to meet current codes to serve these bedrooms. Note that this photograph was taken when the building was not occupied. Otherwise, the fold-up beds that are sitting in the corridor would probably be considered to be a hazard. Existing stairs. This is one of the areas where the code is applied pretty heavily. They are allowed to be maintained barring the presence of a distinct hazard. Non-conforming width, run, rise, including winders that are not allowed by regular code are allowed to remain. Non-conforming handrails are also allowed, and non-conforming baluster spacings are specifically provided for under a separate paragraph that deals with railings. Some examples. This is what you would expect to see. This is the main ornamental stair from the Rotunda building in the city of Oakland. The handrail on the right does not conform but was allowed to remain. This had some issues with dishing of the marble stairs because there had been so much traffic on it over the years. But again, that was allowed to be maintained in place. I want to show this one next. Somehow this gotten out of order. This stair is also in the Rotunda building. It's a utility stair. Again, we have a nonconformance here on rise and run, nonconformance in handrails and in baluster spacing. But it's important to note that this doesn't look like what people think of as a historic stair, and yet it is one of the original stairs, and it is allowed the same provisions of the State Historical Building Code that a fancy stair is. This is a stair at Moore Cottage at the Wilona Hotel in Yosemite. It was access to the cupola you see on the right. It had problems not only with run and rise. I think at maximum it was like a 7-inch tread and a 9-inch rise. But you can see the handrail drops off, there's winders, and there was even the head height problems because that door is in the ceiling. Since it only accesses cupola, it was allowed to remain. There was some concern about whether children might run up and down these stairs and whether it would be hazardous, and I think this was covered by just a simple rope and a sign at the bottom of the stair, and the stair was allowed to remain in place. I'm waiting. Main entry doors. The main issue that we get with main entry doors is usually not a problem of width because they tend to be large, but that they're hung to swing in inward as opposed to in the direction of travel, and this specific provision allows them to remain in that configuration. Especially if there if all the other exits that are required to be provided for the occupancy do swing in the direction of travel. Existing fire escapes. This provision is actually quite important because fire escapes are no longer really provided for in the regular code. They can be maintained and used as a required exit. Access can be from a window as long as it meets the requirements of the Chbc for the sill height. And if you do run into a problem with sill height, that can be mitigated by just providing a step at the front of the window rather than changing the window opening itself. This is an example. This is an office building in Richmond. It's about 4 stories. Above the first floor level, the office is U-shaped. The whole building is U-shaped. And at the end, each end of the U is a fire escape that provides the only exit. Those corridors would be considered to be dead-end corridors and too long not to have an exit at the end. These fire escapes were allowed to provide that exit. They provided it through a window, through an intervening office, which is not typically allowed, but in this case it was. Because we had a cautious building owner, we did a complete examination, a structural examination of the fire escapes to make sure that they were in good shape, which they were. The little bit of corrosion you see was not a big issue. In addition, the CHBC allows for new fire escapes to be provided. This is, again, not allowed in the regular code. In fact, all the provisions for the requirements for a new fire escape have been removed from the code. So what has been done with the CHBC is provisions from previous codes have been codified in the CHBC, so that gives you basically the minimum measurements, minimum widths, etc., for providing a new fire escape. I have one example here. This is actually provided to me by Cindy Heitzman. This is a project that originally was a hotel. It was converted to an office use. That required a second exit that was not provided originally. The building footprint was so small that to provide a second exit on the interior would have pretty much blown the possibility of reusing it as an office building. They happened to have an adjacent parking lot that was owned by the same owner, and as you can see here, through a window in a corridor, they were allowed to build a new fire escape that exited to that parking lot. This is a provision that specifically applies to dwelling units. Typically, a dwelling unit below the 4th floor and or in a basement needs to have an escape window. What this does is just provide a smaller required square footage, smaller width and height dimensions than are allowed in regular code. And finally, we get to railings and guardrails. This is in a funny place in the code. It's at the end of the chapter. It actually probably will end up getting moved into the same section that covers stairs. But essentially, it allows for the height of railings and guardrails to remain, continue in use at their historic height and spacing unless a distinct hazard has been identified or created by a change in use or occupancy. This is the Little White Cottage at the Wilona. This is a handrail or a guardrail that's probably about 30 inches in height. Clearly, the spacing is much wider than is allowed in current code. Not a particularly hazardous condition, in terms of the height of the porch off the grade. That was allowed to remain.
Hey, Alan, can I interject?
Yeah.
I would just suggest that, especially with regards to railings, that the notion of a distinct hazard has everything to do not only with the physical conditions, i.e. how far you're going to fall. The Winona case doesn't look like that would be too bad of a consequence if you did topple over that railing, but also the nature of your use. And if it's a use like the slide you're about to show in, say, an office building or a business use where people generally behave themselves, it's probably a lot less likely to be a distinct hazard. And if you're in a use where people behave badly sometimes, and I'll show that in my case study, that sometimes a distinct hazard would have a different definition.
Yeah, and Chris makes a very good point. This is another shot of the Rotunda building in Oakland. This has a lot of interesting characteristics to it. It's about 3 or 4 stories fall on the other side of this railing. The railing is lower than is allowed, but it's quite wide. So to some extent, that actually mitigates the fact that it's low. The balusters are much more widely spaced than would typically be allowed by regular code, but that's a protection against falling by children. And in this case, the fact that this was converted from the original use as a department store to office use probably has mitigated that hazard to some extent, because you've got a lower occupancy, you've got much fewer children in a space like this, and probably fewer unsupervised children as well. The other interesting thing about this particular example is that this is not the original baluster. The original baluster had been removed by Kahn's department store when they actually infilled this floor, but we had original drawings, and so this was a recreation, reconstruction, and this points out the fact that the CHBC actually covers reconstructions as well as preservation of existing historic material. What we have to recognize is that none of these chapters in the CHBC actually stand on their own, and there are other provisions in other chapters that apply to egress. Chapter 8-4, which deals with fire-resistant construction, has a number of provisions that apply specifically to corridors. In general, as you see in the first alternative, the automatic sprinkler system alternative, 1-hour construction is not required where an automatic sprinkler system is provided. And in cases where a 2-hour corridor might be required, which is pretty rare, the presence of an automatic sprinkler system would reduce that requirement to 1 hour. The second alternative, which is the approved life safety evaluation, is not used as often as a sprinkler system, but it's probably more important because it gives a good deal of leeway for a building owner to provide an analysis to the jurisdiction that's actually doing the plan review to demonstrate that their exiting plan is safe even if it doesn't meet the specific provisions of the regular code. Back to the Rotunda building. Somehow my slides are out of order here. This is a view of the entire atrium, and as you can see, it's open to that central space. And as an atrium, it really wasn't allowed to be open because those are the exiting corridors you're seeing. You're seeing that there's glass at the 5th story level, and I can explain what happened here. When we went to the building department with this, trying to leave these stories open, what we did is we had a smoke evacuation analysis done by an engineer. And what they showed was that the current venting in the dome and the height of the dome itself actually allowed for a good deal of accumulation of smoke in that area without affecting the lower stories, while people would have a chance to exit the building. It was determined that the 5th story was close enough to the dome that it might be affected, and so the decision was to enclose that and leave the others open. This would not be typically allowed in regular code without either a more complying exiting system or smoke evacuation equipment that we couldn't actually fit into the building in terms of protection of historic material. This is a plan of the building. Oops. This is a plan of the building. Just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, that central area in the middle, that is the exiting corridor. These are offices on the outside, and this is the open atrium in the middle. Our exits are at these 2 corners and down here into Kahn's Alley. The exiting distance was also longer than was allowed by code, but again, with the provision of an evaluation by an engineer that showed that there would be time for exiting, before smoke might intrude into these spaces, it was allowed to remain that way. The next provision I wanted to look at, and Chris is going to show you some examples of how those was applied. You are allowed to have openings in fire-rated systems, and here we're talking about corridors specifically. Historical glazing materials were typical in office buildings of the 20s, where there were doors and transoms and windows that were provided to allow for transmission of light from the outside into the interior corridors, which is a nice feature of the buildings. What the CHBC does is it allows these to remain in place with the provision of smoke seals and with sprinklers provided on both sides of the glazed areas. Let's see if I have an example. Yeah, I do have an example. This is, again, pretty typical office building of the 20s, and you can see the glazing and the transoms around the door, and the door is a glass door itself. I'm going to hand this over to Chris, and we'll be back to answer questions if you have any. Thank you.
Cindy, do I have control now? I
You
guess
do.
so. Good afternoon. I'm going to take many of the lessons that Alan just imparted to us and apply it to a single project that we did about 12 years ago, and use it as a case study to talk about some of the prescriptive remedies that Alan talked about, but a few other things I want to cover. First, I want to talk a little bit about accessing the CHBC for non-listed buildings. We'll talk about the building in question and how it had been originally designed and how it had been sort of subsequently designed by generations of fire marshals and maintenance personnel. Talk a little bit about sprinklers, which have been the key to unlocking many of these alternative approaches. Show some examples of some of the same prescriptive remedies that Alan just showed, and then sort of a performance approach to one particular feature of the building that didn't fit into any of these neat prescriptive remedies. Okay, here it is, Toyon Hall at Stanford University, built in the early 20s by Bakewell and Brown. Bakewell and Brown were the very prolific campus architects between 1910 and the early 30s. They did well over 100 buildings on campus, including some of the campus's most treasured resources. This was a men's dormitory that originally housed about 180 students. When they opened now, it's a co-ed dormitory and houses about 250. It's basically a two-story building with a single third-story wing, which you see between those towers in the center. And it had been not really touched much in any meaningful way other than sort of piecemeal renovations. This is an existing photograph of some very serious and well-dressed undergraduates circa 1923. This building certainly looks historic. If you evaluate the credentials of Bakewell and Brown, it certainly meets, it meets several of the criteria for historic eligibility. I think any reasonable person would say, boy, that looks like a great historic building. The university, in their wisdom, has a policy against listing any of their resources, and it occurs at a very, very high level in the university, well above that they let the architects talk to, and it basically, I believe, is a remnant of a perceived land use restriction that they want to reserve their rights for these buildings to do what they want. Of course, that's sort of a false sense of security under CEQA, because nowadays, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, preservation planners have sort of gotten really rigorous about evaluating buildings all over 50 years, whether they're listed or not. At the time we did this project, the university had never allowed the CHBC to apply to even an obviously historic building without it being placed on a register. And when we began the project and we saw all of the remedies that were prescribed by the CHBC, we very much wanted to access that and had to go about sort of proving to them that this building was appropriate to apply to this building. Now, you've seen this definition, I think, in Alan's presentation, and it has to be a governmental jurisdiction that recognizes it. It can't be, the Friends of Toyon Hall or the Palo Alto Historical Society. We pinned our hopes on the following phrase, which is designated on or determined eligible. And what does that mean? Well, it means that how did we go about this? Or in the words of the building official, when I decided to vet this approach with him, he said, eligible says who? And what we did is we commissioned a credentialed preservation architect who was recognized and well known locally to building officials to prepare a nomination form, which clearly demonstrated that it was eligible for even national recognition. And then marched it into the jurisdiction and talked to their planner. Now, at the time, actually, they didn't have a preservation planner, so their planning department was a little bit hesitant. Nowadays, they do have a preservation planner, and it's much easier. But at the time, they actually were still sort of scratching their head. This was a sort of between-the-lines approach that they couldn't check a box. And so we ended up taking it up to Chbc for a courtesy review of the nomination form. And even though Chbc had no jurisdiction over this project, they sort of wrote a friend of the court brief in support of this. And the building official, to his great credit, went and conferred with the county council and came back and said, okay, we're going to allow this. But rather than just sort of throwing the book on the table and saying, do what you want, we ended up using the alternate methods approach to kind of document every exception to the regular code that we used. This was in 2001, I believe. This process has become very much easier because many jurisdictions now have preservation planners, but a lot of small jurisdictions don't. And so if you find yourself in that situation as a owner or an architect or someone, an applicant for a project, don't take no for an answer if they just say, well, it's not listed, because we believe this approach has statutory merit. I'd like to talk a little bit about the building and its sort of initial DNA, and then some of the changes that had occurred to the building when we got to it. And I don't mean this juxtaposition of slides to be in any way a cheeky, disrespect to the fire marshal. As I interjected in Alan's presentation, you have to think about who the occupants and the users of this building are. There are 250 late adolescents, early adults, basically 18 and 19-year-olds living away from home for the first time, and they've been known to get up to all manner of hijinks and even take a drink now and again. So, the fire marshal, quite rightly, and the building officials were doing their job to make this building safe and conform to codes that weren't in existence in 1923. But the net result is, and of course I completely support that mission, the net result was it was done in a kind of a piecemeal fashion where the university didn't have the money to wholesale renovate the building at the time, and so they would do these small interventions that had a big impact, as you see on the right. Here's a typical first and second floor plan. This is actually the ground floor plan. A typical beautiful Bakewell & Brown floor plan with absolutely crystal clear circulation. The center portion of the building is the big lounges and lobbies with the public spaces, and then the finger wings are double-loaded corridors. But in order to sort of mitigate that long, endless corridor feel, they had glass transoms above all the doors to student rooms. So those are the arrows going up and down at mid-wing, which allowed both light and air to penetrate the corridors, and then the long views down the corridors terminated through glass doors in the sort of horizontal dimension into either the main lobby or a more modest lounge at the end of the corridor with an architectural fireplace and feature, and in the sort of up-down direction, at major stairs or entrances. So every view was very carefully framed, and the corridors had quite a nice feel originally. The fire marshals, though, in an effort to basically create nominal 1-hour construction and nominal 1-hour fire enclosures for the exit stairs at the ends of the wings, basically boarded up the transoms and the glazed lights and doors, and took out French doors at the ends of corridors and replaced them with kind of standard issue 3070 hollow metal fire doors. So the corridors became quite dreadful in their feel, quite dark. The building lost a lot of its character. And here you can kind of see this is one of those stair enclosures, and on the door on your right formerly was a pair of glazed French doors. The door on your left, the same thing. But it did create a much safer stair enclosure so that any fire on the ground floor wouldn't compromise this stair from the second floor. Here's a view of the corridors as we found them. The transoms above the doors have been blocked off. Fortunately, the historic glass was still there. They had just covered it with plywood or gypsum board. And in some cases, door lights were occurred, and those were also covered up. And then finally, in an effort to separate the A from the R occupancy, R1 being the congregate residence, a fairly hazardous occupancy, because not only are these 18 and 19-year-olds doing all manner of, ingeniously stupid things for Stanford students, but they're sleeping in the building while maybe their neighbor is, burning a candle in their room. So it is a hazardous occupancy. This building had fires, and people are asleep, and so quite rightly, the building officials were very conservative. In this case, the blue lines indicate occupancy separations between the A3 and the R1 occupancy, so that trouble wouldn't spread from, say, a party raging in the lounge to down the halls. But again, it really violated the sort of partie of Bakewell and Brown, that sort of beautiful long view down the vistas of the corridors. So we're very fortunate, unlike the sort of piecemeal approach where small projects had been done to create safety. We had a very major project here. It was over $10 million, and it was doing a seismic project, and it doing wholesale, sort of whole cloth improvements to the building, and that was a great advantage. And one of our charges, because it's the university policy, was to fire sprinkler the building and install a compliant fire alarm. And as Alan alluded to, and I'll stress, the fire sprinklers tend to be the easiest way to leverage most of the remedies under the building code, and both prescriptive and performance. And I've been in many meetings with fire marshals and building officials, and when you state emphatically that you're going to fire sprinkler the building, they tend to the creases between their brows tend to relax, and they kind of breathe a sigh of relief, because it's probably the one thing you can do to a building that increases its life safety coefficient the most dramatically. But again, the intent of the code is to provide minimum standards, reasonably equivalent alternatives, and an adequate means of egress. Not a good one, not a great one, but an adequate one. So the code doesn't set the bar incredibly high. However, as Alan pointed out, the words reasonably equivalent and adequate are ones that you have to come to agreement with. It's not, you can't look them up in a dictionary and point to a particular solution. So even though the building official, if it's a listed building, has an obligation to use the code, and in this case a negotiated obligation to use the code for a non-listed building, that doesn't mean that you won't agree, that they'll agree on what all these standards are. And so it's best to think of your building official as your partner and not your adversary. Um, Fire alarm systems, again, are one of the prerequisites for accessing most of the sort of juicy stuff in the CHBC that helps you preserve fabric, and that's generally something that's relatively easy to integrate into buildings. But sprinklers are really the prize, and they're you know, in this condition, it even says that it can mitigate a distinct fire hazard in and of itself with no other improvements, and of course it allows the prescriptive things that Alan described, like the elimination of 1-hour corridors and the restoration of historic glazing, etc. Interestingly enough, though, the buck stops there. You cannot use that to substitute for the required number of exits, or even I found the distribution of exits. So it won't go that far. And other technologies, of which I don't have a lot of experience, but there are these other performance and sort of what I call higher tech approaches of smoke and heat detection and evacuation, or simply a building model that shows that there's time to get out. I think Alan used that as example at the Rotunda building. I've not done that, but of course they're available to us. Now, congratulations, you've got the building official to agree that if you sprinkler a building, you can do X, Y, and Z. Now the hard part starts, and oftentimes, I'm sure we've all been in historic buildings that may have used this provision, but then ran a 3-inch sprinkler main down the lobby, and to what end? I mean, you're preserving historic fabric, and you're also sort of denigrating it. This was really true in this building, where this the most challenging aspect of inserting these life safety systems was in this groin vaulted lobby. And you can see on the left, when we got to the project, they had already sort of put in a fire sprinkler system with festooning the ceiling with lots of conduit. And just imagine a 3 or 4 inch fire sprinkler line running through that space. So we were really ambitious, and we didn't want to, you know, kind of destroy the building to save it. And we also got very lucky and found an exposed space above the floor, in the floor above. So this is on the ground floor. The structural slab above had a furred space above the concrete and below the finished floor of about 4 inches. And we were able to sort of carve open that space and run our fire sprinkler piping and our alarm conduits and quite a bit else, quite frankly, in that little 3 or 4 inch space that you see in the left at that little detail. And that, again, had the fire marshals and the fire sprinkler maintenance folks kind of scratching their heads, because they usually like the piping and the valves for their systems to be on the same floor as the equipment. But we were able to negotiate that through on a kind of a shop drawing level. They got that to that level of detail, and then we covered it all. We documented it very carefully so they know where the pipes are if they had to get to them, and then we covered it back up with wood. And so we were able to accomplish that very sensitive space, and all you see are devices. There's no distribution or piping or conduit. So every building has its own challenges. That's one we particularly relish, and sometimes we're able to conceal it, sometimes not, but it's something that you really have to pay attention to and not do more harm than good. So these are some illustrations of many of the same prescriptive things that Alan talked about, with a couple of twists. And this is that stairwell that you saw earlier, and you see that slide on the lower right. We were able to take those fire doors out and replace them with glazed doors. Now, under the CHBC, technically we could have made those regular old doors, non-rated glass. Because the technology is now available for fire-rated glass, and it was simply an economic issue, we elected voluntarily to say, look, we're going to put back the glazing. We're not going to make them, you know, rated in the traditional sense, but we're going to put in Firelight glass, and we'll get, I think we got a 45-minute rating. We didn't have to do that, but it all played into a sort of building-wide approach that would pay off in a negotiation over the main stair. So my lesson here is, don't necessarily take everything that the code gives you. If there's a reasonable technological solution that exists now and maybe didn't exist 20 years ago. If it makes sense, take it. Similarly, we didn't have to raise the guardrails, but we did, and we provided handrails on both sides of these stairs. So we could have probably negotiated our way out of that, but didn't feel that it was necessarily prudent. Here's essentially the top of that stair from the second floor, and the slide on the right's a little crummy, but it should illustrate a drywall partition with a 3/0 hollow metal door in it. And of course, we were able to take that out, so we were able to sort of open up these kind of improvised stair enclosures and open it to the corridor, allow the natural light from that great big window to spill into the corridor. Here again, though, there was a 32-inch balustrade, and we raised it to 42. We could have tried to negotiate away from that under the prescriptive aspects of the code, but did not feel that was safe given the occupancy and what these kids get up to. And in fact, there had been an incident at this building. I don't know if it was this stair or another stair where a kid fell and was seriously injured. So, building official, owner, and architect kind of all were in complete agreement on this, that it doesn't make sense simply to preserve a little bit of historic character at the risk of safety. So I guess the technical thing we did is we declared this a distinct hazard, and we went ahead and mitigated it.
Yeah,
probably.
Yeah, certainly you don't have to declare it a distinct hazard. What we're continually looking for is, the balance of preservation of historic material and the provision of what we consider to be a safe occupancy. So I don't want to confuse people by thinking that you have to call it a distinct hazard. That's an adversarial position and generally brought in by the building official himself. So
okay.
Just to add that.
I'll talk about the relationship that we had with both the owner and the building official kind of at the end, but I'll just say it was highly collaborative. Probably the biggest prescriptive remedy, sort of bang for our buck, was cleaning up these corridors. What you don't see, of course, are the new fire sprinklers. We furred the ceiling down just slightly in this case, and we're able to conceal everything. But we reopened the glass lights and the transoms, and the amount of natural light that floods the corridor now is remarkable. And of course, at the end of the corridors, we have French doors now instead of those single hollow metal doors. And because the corridors are so long, and because they become kind of a de facto students' social space, kind of a small scale, people leave their doors open. Incredibly important improvement to the life of the house. Although I would note one heartbreaking thing for an architect is I went back, and many of the students had covered up their glass transoms with posters and stuff because the lights from the corridors, the night lights shine in there, the emergency lights shine in, and so if they had a window next to one of the night lights, they would cover it up. So you can't design around that. I guess we should have come up with a better egress lighting scenario. I'm going to conclude with what I call a performance approach to this main stair, which you saw earlier. There was nothing prescriptive that applied to this. When it was originally constructed, it connected 3 stories with no smoke or fire barrier, and I assume that was allowed in 1923, although we had no documentary evidence that it did. We couldn't find codes from that era. It connected an A and an R occupancy. Not only that, even worse, the R occupancy had to exit through the A. So if on the theory that probably hazardous things could happen in the A with a big event raging, that the egress load for the dormitories above would pass through this, and everyone was very uncomfortable with that. It didn't have any guardrails compliant or handrails. And it was also the only stair that served that central third story that I pointed out in the original photograph. And that was probably the biggest problem, is that there's about 25 residents on the third floor, and this was their only stair down. And when we got to the project, you saw the image on your right earlier. They had enclosed with similar architectural detailing at every landing. So at 1, 2, and 3, it still discharged, however, through the A occupancy at the lobby, and there was no second means of egress except for a fire escape. And I believe the fire escape was actually original to Bakewell and Brown. But you know, fire escapes are probably a good idea for some occupancies. Here it was more of an attractive nuisance. And you see it on the upper right in red. That fire escape was, 50 feet in the air. There were some pretty tall floor-to-floors in this building, maybe 35 feet, but high enough to be precarious. It exited down onto a lower roof, so it was sort of a treacherous journey down, and of course students used it for all manner of recreation, so as well as a potential pathway into the building for intruders. So from an institutional point of view, even though it's allowed under the CHBC, no one liked this. I didn't feel comfortable as the second means of egress, and nor did the building official, even though it's prescribed. So here's another case where our judgment was, let's not avail ourselves of this remedy, but look for a different one. And you can see on the left, the stair terminates. This is the top of that main stair, and so that was the only one that connected all this. So what was our compliance strategy? Well, first of all, and we worked really hard to develop a level of trust with the building and fire officials by meeting with them early and often in a working environment where we would be literally sketching and working on alternatives, and all metaphorically sitting on the same side of the table rather than apart from one another. Of course, we said, we're going to sprinkler the building, we're going to have a compliant alarm system. And then we started throwing things in that maybe we didn't need to do, which was these fire-rated glazed enclosures at all the floor landings, not just at the main stair, but at the other ones. So that we were not going for the minimum approach, the minimum adequate, but trying to make the building as safe as we could. In other ways, we provided compliant guardrails and handrails and striping and egress lighting and signage and all the things that make stairs and exit enclosures safer. And then finally, we were able to sneak in a second internal stair from the third to the second floor, kind of under the roofs of the adjacent flanking wings, sort of building a ship in a bottle. It was very intricate, but it met all the code clearances, and we were able to remove the fire escape. And in return, we were allowed to reopen the bottom of the stair. And here's the plan. You can see the fire escape, which was formerly in red, is gone. And then there's a new stair that kind of snakes down to the second floor on the right-hand side of that wing. Now, in a perfect world, that stair would have been a 3-story enclosure that exited directly to the exterior, and of course we were not able to do that. It ends up dumping you into a second floor corridor, and then you get into a non-enclosed stair that then gets you down through the building, but does require that you traverse other corridors, and in some cases even go through the lounge and the lobby. The lobby. And so none of these things are really compliant, and you can't look any of this sort of wholesale solution to this problem up in any portion of either the regular code or the CHBC. I'd say the lessons are that, and here you have the sort of triptych of the historic on below, and the sort of pre-project condition, and then finally the restoration of the open stair. You'll notice the handrails are new, getting you safely down to the lobby level. And I think everyone was very, very happy about this and considered it one of the triumphs of the project. And really the lesson of it was that We tried to use a combination of regular code solutions where possible and combine them with the CHBC solutions. Within the CHBC, to use a combination of prescriptive and performance solutions. And in fact, we tried to limit the use of prescriptive standards if we didn't need them, and sort of, I would say, strengthen the level of safety elsewhere in the building to get the building official to really look at this as a holistic approach rather than issue by issue. So if we were able to make a stair at the end of a wing more safe through a combination of prescriptive and performance, it sort of alleviated their worry load on the main stair. And the third point is probably the most important, is that we had a really terrific collaboration. It was not ever confrontational, and we all kind of had this working relationship where, you know, anyone could veto something if somebody really felt like something wasn't safe. We wouldn't push it. And it was amazing how, in some cases, the building officials were a little bit more, I don't know if I should use the word daring or simply flexible than we were. But I could say that we had 100% consensus on all of these things. And I think the next point, don't take every available solution if it's not safe. For instance, the guardrails, which might make sense in a courthouse or in Alan's examples, but not in an undergraduate dormitory. And don't take every available solution if there is a new technology, i.e. fire-rated glass, that could preserve or restore the historic aspect and actually perform at a modern level. And lastly, you know, as much as we love to give historic buildings a new life, whether it's adaptive reuse or a restoration, the architect's duty, of course, is by statute to protect health and safety, as well as historic fabric, and they frequently conflict, and I think our duty and the challenge is to find a reasonable solution to both charges. And with that, they'll open it up for any questions.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Alan. There are several takeaways from this presentation, and each requires a negotiation with the authority having jurisdiction. In the case of Chris, as you pointed out, the starting with whether a building is listed or a, quote, qualified historical building, there was a negotiation with the planning department as an authority having jurisdiction. The building and fire departments were engaged when you were talking about fire protection system as equivalent protection as to mitigate a less or a non-conforming condition. Who determines whether a condition is a distinct hazard? Is it the building department? Is it the architect? All of the above? Can you comment on the process and the difference between distinct hazard and imminent hazard?
You know, I'll pass it off to Chris. As I said, the term distinct hazard is really setting the standard for the building official to make a determination. So generally, it's the building official that would make the determination of distinct hazard. As an architect, if there's a condition that I think is dangerous, I can mitigate that, you know, through the proposed design. There's no reason for me to find a distinct hazard. In terms of what, you know, distinct hazard means, the code is pretty clear, and I'm not pulling up the definition here, but it really is, you know, something that is an imminent danger. So it's not something that, if there are certain conditions that develop, might be a problem. It really is saying that this is a condition that is obvious on the face of it, is going to be a problem for the building carrying out its, you know, its life safety responsibilities. So it's a little hard to, you know, to pick one, but it's got to be, you know, something where you've got a clear hazard that's going to be present in any exiting scenario or any other, you know, scenario that's affected by it. As Chris was saying, and I think it's very important, once you get into that situation where the building official is taking the position that something is a distinct hazard, and the architect or owner is taking the position that it's not, you're in for some problems. The building official it doesn't really necessarily have any pressing need to preserve historic material. He's mostly looking at protecting life safety. And that's, if he's pushed into a position, that's the position he's going to take. And transversely, the owner may be looking at economic situation or the loss of historic material. Once you're in that situation, it's not a good way to come up with a solution. As Chris was saying, if you're in a negotiating position, where you can look at the whole thing as a holistic approach to life safety, you're in much better shape.
Isn't part of your job, Alan, on the State Historic Building Safety Commission to mediate these, or not mediate, but arbitrate these disputes between applicants and building officials?
Yeah, there's an appeal function that's actually codified in the code, and what that's there for is, to deal with a situation where you have two entrenched positions, one on the side of the building jurisdiction, the building code official, and one on the side of the owner, and that can be brought to the board. And the board is made up of code officials, architects, engineers of all types, representatives of state agencies. It's a pretty broad coverage of expertise, and they will make a determination, or we will make a determination as to whether or not we come down on the side of the building official or down on the side of the owner. There are things that can be done short of that, and often what is done is a letter is written to our executive director who resides in DSA, and a question is put. Sometimes, and then what's generally done is our executive director comes to our executive committee and says, here's an issue I've got, what do we think? And often we can then resolve that by either explaining to an owner that they may be misinterpreting the code, or explaining to a building official that we think the code applies and this is the result. And we do get cooperation, from both sides in that situation. And that, the appeal process is onerous because both people have to show up in order to make it a good process, and that's going to cost time and money for both the building official and for the owner.
Yeah, and from a practical point of view, if you're an architect working in a region and you're going to have to go in and talk to that building official next year about the next project, you may not have as friendly a reception. So I haven't had to resort to appeals. I've been fortunate to work with what I would consider to be incredibly creative code officials in our practice, and I don't think creativity is a word that people necessarily assign to these folks very often, but I stand by that. I mean, I think they were really into the spirit of it, and they really wanted to help accomplish our goals. And I would just say that to the greatest extent possible, to keep it a consensus-based and not adversarial, if not for your one project, for the next one that you might have for a particular institution. I mean, a place like Stanford University, you obviously want to set a precedent for using these kind of strategies and accessing the State Historic Building Code, but you also don't want to burn your bridge because you're going to end up dealing with those code officials for the subsequent projects if you're so lucky. So it's a fine line, and I have made compromises on historic fabric to keep a relationship viable, and that's a strategic decision, and I think it was the right one, and I don't think it was an adverse historic impact. But I think preservationists, you line 10 of them up in a row, and they probably would have different opinions on that. I remember getting some negative feedback on our handrail issue, the one that we raised. That, boy, why didn't you fight for that? And it was like, I didn't think it was safe. So there's a lot of gray area here.
Right. I have another question. Do either of you have experience with the use of mist fire sprinkler systems?
No.
Yeah, I don't specifically. Sorry, I can't comment.
Yeah. We did hold a webinar on fire protection systems a couple of months ago, which was, if any of you did not attend it, you could look at a rebroadcast of it. It was very informative and covered a range of different fire protection systems. I have another question. There was mention of life safety evaluation as an alternative allowed under the code. Who prepares a life safety evaluation, and what are the elements taken under consideration?
It's an architect. I mean, anyone can prepare it, and the question is what kind of viability that can have with the building official. An architect can certainly prepare it. In the case of the Rotunda building, we actually had an outside consultant who could specifically model smoke evacuation and was qualified to do that. So it was basically a fire suppression engineer who did that. I think it's probably a case-by-case basis. All these issues are dealing with the fact that regular code, is heavily prescriptive, and it's easy for it to be designed that way because it's saying you haven't built the building yet. This is what the provisions we would like you to meet, and so the building can be designed around those provisions. The reason the CHBC has so few prescriptive provisions is because even the ones that are included sometimes, as Chris pointed out, don't necessarily apply to the building that you're dealing with. So whereas we say existing handrails can remain in place even if they aren't adequate height or correct spacing of the balusters, it might be a situation where that is, it does actually produce a hazardous condition. So the idea that everybody has to keep in mind here is all of a sudden you've got an amorphous situation where you're trying to define what's safe for a particular building. The prescriptive elements of the regular code often don't apply because really what's the difference between a 44-inch corridor and a 42-inch corridor? 44 inches appeared to be, the most appropriate size when the regular code was being written. But, for the existing building you've got that didn't happen to be built that way, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's unsafe. So, if you end up setting up a battle of prescriptive versus prescriptive, you're in trouble because the CHBC doesn't provide enough in that area.
I would add that my experience with life safety evaluations is they're almost always performed by specialty consultants, and those specialty consultants are usually trained fire protection engineers. And in addition to a great deal of technical knowledge, the other thing they bring is many of the good ones sit on the state boards with the code officials. They help write the codes. They go to the same code summer camps together, I think, euphemistically speaking. And sometimes what you're bringing in is that whole notion of collaboration and trust, is that you're hiring a fire protection engineer to be your advocate, and they already have a built-in trust relationship with code officials. They maybe went through school together, or they did training together, or a lot of these fire protection engineers did stints as plant checkers and fire marshals. So it's a relatively small community of people, and like any community, it is built on relationships and trust, especially when you start to get into these determinations of what's reasonable. The evaluations almost always start with a basic exiting and fire, basically almost a reverse engineered code search on the project. So they'll talk about allowable area and construction type and how it varies from current standards, but how maybe it met the original intent. And then they kind of do a side-by-side comparison of regular and proposed or regular code requirements and existing conditions. And then they'll sort of make arguments in various degrees of technical detail about whether an egress system is adequate or whether there's sufficient area to confine smoke and that sort of thing. So some of it's very, very technically and sort of calculated approach, and others are simply, I'm a fire protection engineer, I think this is safe, and it sort of helps build the consensus.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the points made here, woven throughout the presentation from both of you, is the importance of collaboration and working with the building departments, fire departments, and the planning departments. In my experience, this is perhaps one of the most important points or underpinnings of a successful project when using the state historical building code, is approaching this as a collaborative effort, and as Chris pointed out here, not a confrontation. And I want to thank you both for pointing that out. I think it's one that's often overlooked when we talk about the application of the state historical building code, is that it is very important to approach this as a collaborative effort and begin your negotiations and conversations with the local authorities early so that you can give time to develop a reasonable and appropriate solution to protect the resource but provide the equivalent level of safety. I want to go ahead, Alan.
Let me just interject a minute. One of the things that Chris pointed out is that for the Toyon Hall rehabilitation, they actually codified all the changes that they made in AMRs and alternative method reports, I think is what it is. And we did the same thing in the Rotunda building. And while that's not required, because we're essentially meeting the CHBC, it basically gave the building official backup data, backup information as to how the decision was made, why it was found to be a safe condition even though it didn't meet regular code. And it helps us not to be resistant to that type of codification, because it gives them the backup material they need in case there is any liability question that comes up later on.
Yeah, it also gives you something to point to the next time you're coming through and you have a similar issue with the same jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also provides background information if another inspector or plan reviewer is coming behind the one that already made the decision. You have the rationale behind that to back up that decision. It's very important, and you're right, that is not required by the code, but it's a good practice. Well, we have no other questions, and so I want to thank you both for making this presentation today and thank our audience for joining us today. You will receive an email with a link to a survey and a link to the PDF copy of this presentation. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar and, of course, recommendations for future topics. And I would like to add that if you are not a member of the California Preservation Foundation, we encourage you to join as an individual, a nonprofit, a government, or a corporate member. Each member receives benefits, including discounts to all of our programs, such as webinars like this, workshops, our conference, and the Preservation Design Awards program, and of course our members-only tours. I'd like to also remind everyone that we do have our annual conference coming up May 1st through the 3rd in Orange County at the Crown Plaza Anaheim Resort. There's still time, of course, to register. Some of the tours are filling up. We would encourage you to join us. It's really a terrific lineup. We have a workshop coming up next week in Los Angeles at the Hercules campus at Playa Vista. It's called Hangar to High Tech, Reimagining Post-Industrial Adaptive Reuse. It's at the former Howard Hughes Aerospace Center at Playa Vista, near Marina Vista in LA. And then we have two other webinars, actually three coming up. One on Tuesday, April 23rd, Materials Conservation, Wood. Speakers are Carolyn Searles and Janelle Leafblad with Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heger. We have one on May 21st. It's a Tuesday, Materials Conservation, Concrete, and Masonry, also taught by Carolyn Searles and Janelle Leafblad. And then we begin a series on preservation law and CEQA, and we have a webinar on Tuesday, June 11th called Preservation Law with Diane Kane and Deborah Rosenthal, both members of the CPF board. So we would encourage you to attend. We thank you again for participating. Your attendance at this program helps us fulfill our mission to provide leadership to protect California's historic sites and communities through education and advocacy. Thank you for your support, and you all have a good afternoon.